graphic design is related to other things. And this is something that's interested me in my work, particularly relevant to my work now. A little bit of context, first of all. This is my desk in my studio in London. And all those blue dots are in some way representative of paraphernalia on my desk, which relates to my design work. So although I am involved in education and I do write, as being already referenced, I am primarily a design practitioner. And my studio is called Lucienne Roberts Plus, and the plus is there to make clear that, first of all, I don't work on my own, but also that I think of graphic design as an activity that involves collaboration and lots of other people. So it's not just about me. I've also recently co-founded a venture called Graphic Design And. It's a publishing and events venture. And of course, the and here is meant to imply that graphic design doesn't exist on its own either. Graphic design is always about something else. In fact, in many respects, graphic design would not exist were it not for something else. And I think it's arguable that the something else wouldn't exist without graphic design, in that it's graphic design that makes other things accessible and visible. So it's this, the relationship between graphic design and everything else that really I want to talk about. And I'm going to be doing that by talking a little bit about graphic design and what we're hoping to do in this new venture and how it's working out at the moment. And also through highlighting one of my current design projects. But actually, I'm going to start first by talking about the major bit of research that in a way we're all on, which is asking what the hell are we doing here? And the reason Woody Allen is there on my desk is because I went to see him talk at London's National Film Theatre quite a long time ago now. And he talked about his work as a quality distraction. And he meant a distraction from the existential angst, asking, why am I here? And it got me thinking, it really chimed actually for me, that, can graphic design be a quality distraction? First of all, what do we mean by quality in relation to graphic design? But also, is it an activity that can absorb one so much that it gives your life some form of meaning? Now, obviously, I know that most of my clients, they would think this is absolutely absurd. They wouldn't understand at all why I'm so captivated by it as a subject. But in a way, that doesn't matter. It's whether it helps me to make sense of life, whether it helps me to learn about many aspects of life, which, of course, it does. I have to say, this illustration was produced by an illustrator called Nigel Robinson, and he did it to illustrate a piece of writing that was about this very subject. And he made it in wood, which is also a lovely play on the name of Woody Allen. So the question as to how graphic design be a quality distraction has preoccupied me pretty much from being a student. And I guess that's why most of my work, I would say loosely, is politically engaged. I was very impressed at a very early age actually by graphic design that was applied to messages that were loosely political. So on the left, as opposed to from was produced by the suffragettes, who campaigned for women to vote in Britain at the beginning of the 20th century. So they're not graphic designers, but it's still graphic design employed in a political cause. Obviously in the middle there's a piece by Jan Schickel. I was very impressed also by the early modernists and, constructivists and so on. Distiel, Bauhaus, as referred to earlier. And really because all of those early designers seem to me to be seeing design as a way of furthering some other cause. They were not just interested in design for its own sake. And I was also very, very taken with the designers who worked after the war. On the right is a poster actually by David King, who was working in the 70s, 80s, 90s, very politically engaged British designer. but it's for an exhibition about the architect Bakhtin, who was Russian, came to Britain after the war, and worked on lots of social housing projects. So another example of design applied for all, for the betterment of all. And at the bottom right is First Things First manifesto, which some of you have heard of, I'm sure, produced in the 1960s by the designer Ken Garland. And it argued that graphic designers should take responsibility in their work, mainly by thinking about who they work for. Given that when you transmit ideas, it's very important what those ideas might be. And the question, I guess, is whether you have to, as a designer, support those ideas if your work is going to be helping those ideas to travel further. In 2000, there was a new First Things First manifesto produced, and I'm one of the signatories. So I felt, I guess, being invited to sign that second First Things First, I felt very gratified because the original one had inspired me so much as a student. Anyway, this investigation has led me onto the big subject of ethics, and about 6 years ago I wrote this book, Good, An Introduction to Ethics in Graphic Design. A huge task, very daunting, very scary. I'm not sure that I answered any questions. I think I just raised lots of questions through it. But my research took me into lots of different avenues that were not graphic design. I went and talked to a barrister, who's shown here. I talked to a politician, I talked to an ex-bishop, and I talked to a philosopher. And I asked them all whether they thought graphic design had any relationship to ethics, actually. I tended to start my questioning by saying, is it all about who we work for as graphic designers? Is that what makes a piece of work ethical or not? And I was very interested by the responses. The philosopher, for example, talked to me about free speech. He said, but don't you believe in free speech? Yes, of course I do. He said, well, as a designer, surely your professional ethical code, if you like, should be that you are there to help all messages travel further. It's not about what you believe, it's whether you believe in the notion of people having access to information and knowledge. And if you do, even if that doesn't always jive with your own personal beliefs, surely you should be happy to engage in that activity, which threw me a bit because up until that point I'd always said I will not work, for example, for the Conservative Party, which is the more right-wing party in Britain, and we work for the Labour Party. And it begged questions of me, really. Jackie, the barrister, spoke about what's called the cab-rank rule for barristers, which is that because people are presumed innocent until proven guilty, when a barrister is offered a job, they are duty-bound to take it. It's nothing to do with whether they believe that someone's innocent or guilty. It's on a first-come, first-served basis. They just take that job. And again, that's part of their professional code, so that made me think quite hard. Obviously, I went and talked to designers. I talked to Simon Esterson, for example, who's an editorial designer, and he's done a lot of work for Guardian newspaper, which is a more left-wing newspaper in the UK, about his position in relation to ethics. And I also talked to designers like Rupert Bassett and Lynn Elkins, who were devising a system to test whether your work was truly sustainable or not. Because obviously environmental issues were bound also in talking about ethics. Having gone through this journey, I kind of came back to where I started, which is that I'm very careful about who I work for, and I want to really, because I'm so passionate about what I do, really, I find it very hard to do that job well if I don't find the subject matter that I'm working on to have some value. So as a way of talking about that and talking about how I use research in my work, I'm going to talk about a current project for an exhibition. We do a lot of exhibition design, which is absolutely fabulous because it's a bit like theatre. You build into a first night private view. And quite often the exhibitions that we work on require some kind of almost theatrical approach. They're about atmosphere. So although you're there to make information accessible, you're also there to tell the visitors straight away what they're likely to expect and feel as they go around the show. So we were approached last summer to picture an exhibition called Brains, about brain, obviously, and it's an exhibition that's going to start in March at the Wellcome Trust in London. This is really welcome. The Wellcome Trust are a charitable foundation who put an awful lot of money into medical research, but they also have a wonderful public engagement program that includes exhibitions, because they're interested in engaging the general public in what they do and trying to make it as accessible as possible. So when we were briefed, the thing that we realised very quickly was that this exhibition is not about how the brain works. It's about how the brain, what the brain has come to mean from a cultural perspective. So in many respects, it's a very diverse exhibition, and the material is very broad and eclectic. A lot of it is about collection and classification, though. I didn't realise that the brain is the most collected organ in the world. And there are enormous and impressive and intriguing historical collections of brains. For example, the Cushing collection at Yale, of which this is one example, where you have jar on jar full of brains like this, all labelled and very carefully documented. And they include documentation about the person whose brain it is. And they include photographs and their stories, and in what way they were ill, and why they were operated upon, and why their brain has been kept. And this makes it very poignant that you look at a photograph of this person and then see their brain. It's very, very strange. And this struck us very heavily as something that we had to in some way, the graphics had to kind of reinforce some of that feeling of poignancy and intrigue and mystery, if you like. The exhibition will also include quite a lot of old illustrations, scientific illustrations like these, and these also captivated us partly because of the detail. This is a book that was an 18th century book, partly because of the detail, but also the sort of typographic detailing and the strange sort of nuances of leader lines and boxes and pointers and little bits of italic and full points, and in a way, quite, obviously old-fashioned, if you like, approach as opposed to the way we might think of scientific graphic design now, which is something very clean and modern. The exhibition will also include works of art. This is a piece, it's about the soul, actually, and how the reason why the brain is collected and people are so cautious about getting rid of them is that, in a way, they think of the brain as the embodiment of somebody's soul. And this also struck very heavily with us. And this image is of slices of brains, and that's often how brains are used for a research point of view. They're cut into very tiny, tiny, tiny slices. These are slices of Einstein's brain. And obviously some of that research has been put to ghastly causes, so eugenics, looking at, is the brain of a black person different to the brain of a white person, or a working class person different to a middle class person, which is all pretty hideous, but at the same time very intriguing culturally. But also Einstein's brain, a slice of which I think will be in the show, is hugely valuable. It's almost like having Einstein in the room. That's how people feel about it. So we were working with an architect called Callum Story, and he was very taken with the slices thing. So his initial proposal, and actually what's following through, is that he devised a scheme that in plan form looks like slices. And that also in some way references interconnectivity, because obviously that's often how we think about the brain, how it connects up and how ideas move from one space to another within it in a way. And in terms of the graphic design, to begin with, we wanted to reinforce what Callum was doing. So we looked at lettering that in some way referenced slices and interconnectivity. And we also looked at optical illusions, because obviously how we see the world is via the brain, and the brain plays tricks sometimes. But what actually, this is us at the presentation, actually, just before we knew we got the job. So that's what we presented, but pretty quickly after we got the job, we thought the graphic design bit wasn't quite right. It's very nice for graphic designers to go back and rethink everything, but we did. We thought that actually what we needed to do was something that built upon our knowledge now that we'd acquired about classification and collecting and preciousness. And so what we're investigating at the moment is treating the title as if it is a specimen, so putting it in a specimen jar, but preserved in the way that things are really preserved. And we didn't know how that was done, of course. So we went off and met this wonderful chap called Martin Cook, who's the conservationist at the College of Surgeons in London. And he showed us this poor little mouse and explained to us how he's been preserved. He's in glycerine, which I didn't realise. Obviously in a perspex box, which is bent perspex. And he explained to us why it is that you get multiple images when you look at the mouse from different angles. So a bit hideous to look at, obviously, the mouse, but very interesting for us. And so we looked after a model maker, we talked about how to make our letters, and at the moment this is what's being tested. So this is as far as we've got with this project, but what I'm demonstrating here is how knowledge of the subject has informed the graphic design, and how the graphic design is trying to support the message of the exhibition. But now I'm going to go on and talk about graphic design and. The origins of graphic design and lie in this book, Design Diaries, co-written with Rebecca Wright, who runs the graphic design course at Kingston University. This was commissioned by Lawrence King, and it was a series of case studies of 11 graphic design projects. We were primarily focused on process rather than outcome. So the book's full of, roughs, experimental layouts, sketchbooks, that kind of thing. So what came up for us was how actually what makes graphic design interesting isn't graphic design. It's what graphic design is about and how that informs what we all do, as I've just said. So we started thinking that we really needed to do something that would foreground graphic design and something else. We wanted a structure, we wanted to find a way of tying graphic design to all the subjects under the sun. We thought about using the Dewey library system, but for various reasons that didn't work for us. And then we discovered Bliss. This is Henry Bliss. He was a librarian from America working in the 1930s. And he really wanted to develop a series of classification for knowledge that would allow knowledge to be in more than one place at the same time. And that's what we were interested in. So we wanted a book, let's say, about graphic design that could be catalogued under graphic design, but if it was also about fashion, it could also be catalogued under fashion. Now he developed his system using a typewriter, because of the time in which he did it. So it's quite quirky, it's got odd use of punctuation marks and so on, and there are different codes for different subjects. And these are tied together to create multiple secondary codes, if you like. It's a faceted system. So we decided, right, that's it, we're going to work through this system. We'll be dead before we've got through every subject, but we're going to try. We had a launch event at the Design Museum, and our first project was a graphic design and social science project that was mainly focused on information design in relation to data. We paired together David Shaw, an information designer, and Nicandra Cockrell, who's a social scientist and is very interested in how data is represented graphically. They ran a project that evening in which they asked all the people at the event to fill in a questionnaire. And they put all that data that evening into this Excel file whilst various other things were going on that night. And then, in a rather mad way, Dave, the designer, tried to turn it into some sort of accessible piece of information design that made clear the nuances, that information design on the whole tends to represent things as though they're hard facts, but actually they're often not. Now, people have been asked questions about work, happiness, and their friends and family, and without them realising, they've been asked questions in 3 different ways. They've been asked what their principles were, so what the principle was that informed their decision making. They've been asked questions about their practice, so what they actually do, and they've been asked questions about what they would like to do. And Dave came up with this very simple device, the Venn diagram, using CMYK colours, because obviously graphic designers would understand those. And the overlap in the middle shows how much people actually do what they say they want to do, and how much they say in principle they would like to do. I think he was surprised actually that as an audience on the whole, people did do what they said they wanted to do, because she said generally in her research, that's not what she finds. But what she liked about this was that it defies movement, that things change, that they're not fixed. And later we've taken that data and turned it into a set of postcards actually. We looked at the stats in relation to people at the event who were designers and people who were not designers as a sort of comparative exercise. It's not a big surprise to find that all the graphic designers work terribly hard, for example. And they liked working terribly hard. So, to finish off, I'm going to talk about our first book project. It's a graphic design and literature title. I'm a media typographer, and we were very interested in how the layout of the text informs how you read it. And we think this is something that the public don't fully understand, actually. So we wanted to find a novel that we thought was very well known, that the public have some genuine warmth and to already, and ask 50 at the time, so 50 graphic designers, to lay out page 1 of that novel as a comparative exercise to see how those different layouts affect how you interpret that text. We've ended up with 65 designers are going to be included. It's been a fantastic project and it's going to be published in the spring. But of course our first dilemma was which title, which novel. We ummed and ahed about this. We thought about Proust, we thought that's a bit of a given, isn't it? And we thought about War and Peace, but actually the openings aren't necessarily so great. And then we found out that Charles Dickens, the British novelist, it's his bicentenary this year. And so we thought it has to be a Charles Dickens novel, and we chose Great Expectations because in the text, it opens, it's about an orphan called Pip, and he talks about how he didn't know his parents, but the only clues he has as to what his parents must have been like is to do the lettering that's on their gravestones, and we thought this was a lovely marrying of what we do and the text. So we invited lots and lots of wonderful designers to engage in this activity. Here's a few of them, including the ever-famous Eric Spiegelman, but also Paul Luna, who runs the typography course at Reading, Robin Kinross, who some of you would have heard of, I'm sure, Judith, who wrote the Fractal book that was mentioned earlier, Experimental Jet Set, so on, Jonathan Barbrook, many. And I'm just going to show 6 of the results. The first one on the left is by Rupert Bassett, who defines himself as a modernist. So he's gone for, range left, 1 type size, 1 font, 1 weight. Now, given that generally novels are organised in a symmetrical, sort of nouveau classical way, this is quite a departure. It's interesting as to what it signals. On the right, it is the contribution from spin. Now, I think of spin as a more, loving modernism, so I was very surprised to see this, where they've broken down the text and they're playing with different fonts to try and emphasise different parts of that text. On the left is the contribution from a designer who wanted to do something more political. He thought that the text was all about disenfranchisement, disempowerment, and he wanted to reference a sort of use a contemporary visual analogy for that, and use graffiti as a result. On the right, Experimental Jet Set's entry, which looks more like a form that has to be filled in because they thought that the text emphasised names, relationships of different people in a very structured and quite cold way. And on the left, this one I think is very intriguing because as you'll see, every second line reads backwards. The idea here being that this story is like a river, it's in some way to reinforce the narrative flow of the text. So hard to read, but conceptually very interesting. And on the right is Paul Luna's contribution. Now, Charles Dickens' novels were first published in serial form in newspapers. They weren't published in books at all. So he's gone back and looked at the way the Great Expectations was first presented, and this is what we have here. So, as you can see, even just in these six, what design gives to that text and how it reinforces the text or plays with the text, or how noticeable the design is in relation to the text, informs utterly as a reader what it is that you get from that text, and that's what we're hoping to demonstrate in this title. We're going to be holding an event at the Design Museum about this in April. We're also participating in events through Dickens 2012, which is the organisation that's running various exhibitions and so on about Dickens. So actually our objective is to engage with the public with this. It's not just to do this for designers, but make sure that people who love Charles Dickens actually revisit their reading of this text because of the designer's work. So just to close, Lucienne Roberts plus graphic design land. As you can see, what I'm really interested in is graphic design and everything else. Not graphic design for its own sake, but graphic design in relation to the rest of the world and how it moves out from us into the rest of the world. And I guess, I hope, that this is still my quality distraction. I think it is. Thank you.
Ready?